So this next collab should be pretty interesting. Brian Harpole is sitting down with Paramount Tactical, Gary Melton, and he's basically talking about the Charlie Kirk assassination, and he's also responding to the comments that he's been getting out there on social media, out there in the wild, and also the reactions to his interview with Shawn Ryan. Now let's get into the general vibes of this interview. So I think I prefer the interview with Shawn Ryan because it was more emotional and you could really see the impact that it was having on Brian Harpole. Now I know that in my first video I talked about how he seemed like he wasn't kind of qualified because of how emotional he was, because really these interviews are for him to account for what went wrong that day and for his team to take responsibility for Charlie Kirk losing his life. And so in this interview, he's very tactical. He was focusing on the questions that were being asked and answering from his standpoint as a security person. However, I felt like he rambled with his answers and it was very easy to lose sight of what the question was because he was giving you so much information and it wasn't necessarily relevant to the question, especially because he's trying to reinforce and continue to talk about the training that they do, how qualified his team is, and that just overwhelms you when you have too much information and really you just want a very clear and simple answer to the question. And the other thing that kept bothering me throughout this interview was that he kept saying, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And we can attribute that to Erica Kirk when she gave the speech at the memorial and she was talking about forgiving the killer for taking Charlie Kirk's life. And so he said that a few times throughout this interview, and I didn't really like it because obviously they're talking about Jesus being on the cross, him being persecuted and all of that stuff, and he understands the significance of what they are doing, but they do not. And so when you say that, outside of that type of context, you're giving yourself kind of like superiority over other people and saying that you have more knowledge. Now, I'm more so speaking about Brian Harpole using that line versus Erica Kirk. And so here, what I find interesting is that he's saying, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." And he's really talking about people being uninformed or having the wrong information about him and his team and what happened that day. And I think that this is a little bit problematic because it seems like he doesn't have all of the answers. And you can really see the clash because on one hand, he says that he understands why people are asking questions, he understands why people don't trust the government, but then also he resents the fact that he's caught up in this. He is the fallout for when people don't trust the information that the government is giving about the Charlie Kirk assassination. People are pointing the fingers at his team, and so he's really dealing with the fallout of people wanting answers and not trusting anything other than what they are getting from independent journalists or YouTubers or content creators instead of official channels like mainstream news. Moving on, I want to talk about the previous interview with Shawn Ryan. So I did watch the Behavioral Arts YouTube channel over the weekend, and Spidey did a video on the Brian Harpole interview. And one thing that he was talking about was how he didn't really understand when Brian was talking about the hospital. And basically he's talking about getting Charlie Kirk to the hospital, got in the room, and then not being able to find his phone and needing to contact his family to let them know that he's okay. And he said that he thought that this moment was kind of strange and out of place considering how he felt he was describing the situation, like just like the tone, the wording, and all of that stuff. And he thought that it was misplaced, kind of, that he had concern about his family, knowing that he was okay when in that situation, in that moment, you understand that Charlie's family is not going to see him again. And so what he's saying there is that Charlie's family should be the primary concern in that situation. And I do want to push back on that a little bit because I feel like in that moment, Brian Harpole did everything that he could for Charlie after the fact. And I think once things calmed down a little bit, he did have that opportunity and that right to contact his family and make sure that they knew that he was okay. I don't think that was super out of line, especially given the fact that you are aware that Charlie Kirk may not be going home to his family. And so that would make you want to reach for your family, express that you love them, that you're safe and all of that stuff, right? And so from that perspective, I don't really see anything wrong with him wanting to contact his family in that moment because he did do what he could for Charlie after the fact. He got him to the hospital, he tried to treat the wound, he got at the door and all of that stuff. The other thing I want to talk about is the JFK comment. And so in that first interview, he talked about not wanting the situation with Charlie Kirk to be like JFK, and he was really concerned with making sure that there was an autopsy. And I don't know if he was trying to say that people wouldn't believe that Charlie was dead without the autopsy, but when I think about about JFK, I don't think about people questioning the autopsy, questioning what kind of gun he was shot with. They're more so questioning who killed him and why, right? So you don't believe the official story of why JFK was killed and who shot him. So when you think about it in that sense, his comment doesn't make sense, because what makes this situation like JFK's assassination is the fact that Charlie Kirk was shot in broad daylight for hundreds and thousands of people to witness. So that is what makes it like JFK. So the autopsy is not going to change that. The things that make it like JFK are really outside of your control. Okay, moving on, getting into this interview with Gary. So they talked about foreign influence, and really it seemed like they were trying to say that there's other people who are influencing how Americans or society in general is approaching this situation with Charlie Kirk and the investigation into figuring out what happened, who was involved in all of that stuff. And I don't necessarily like that approach, because there are people who are genuinely watching content, they're watching videos, and they're coming to their own conclusion, and they're either believing it or they're pushing back and asking questions and all of that stuff. So I don't like the idea of saying that people are being intentionally fed this information and they just blindly believe it. There are some people who are like that, but I don't think that that is the bulk of the people who are asking questions and are finding legitimate reasons to question the official narrative of the Charlie Kirk assassination, what TPUSA is doing, and all of that other stuff. And they also kind of dove into the media losing its influence, meaning that the media isn't a place or a source that people trust, and they are turning elsewhere to get that information. And so what does that look like when you're turning to content creators? And they're really talking about how people are lying and they're promoting or spreading false theories, false information, and that is leaving other people vulnerable to ingesting that information. And if they aren't knowledgeable enough to question that, they are going to believe that. And so they're talking about how that's harmful, because one, it puts the security team at risk because people are threatening them, people are harassing them, and all of that stuff. And I totally get what they are saying when they say that, but I also think that it's kind of putting too much or giving too much credit to foreign entities, foreign states, and all of that stuff, and how much they can influence people when it comes to the Charlie Kirk investigation. And the other thing I want to get into is the idea of calling off the event or pulling the event and not letting Charlie Kirk do the UVU event. That was something that came up as a reaction to the Shawn Ryan interview. Myself and other people are saying like, hey, if you felt like you couldn't protect Charlie, you should have just canceled the event. You should have pulled him out. You should not have let him go into that situation. And I personally thought that he should have, if he felt like he couldn't protect Charlie, he should have said, hey, we can't protect you. We can't do this event, right? And so he addresses that in this interview. And he basically at some point says that, we can't just pull Charlie Kirk from this event that he wants to do. We're going to be out of a job the next day. And so you can see the emphasis unintentionally is on you want to keep your job, you want to keep earning the salary that you're getting from that job, instead of being vocal and saying like, hey, this is a bad idea. We definitely need to change a few things and all of that. And so he's really hitting at this idea that you can't cancel every event. You can't make changes, especially when you don't have control over the venue and you are really relying on other people to provide the resources that you need, right? Because he constantly, in the original interview with Shawn Ryan and this interview, he didn't do it as much, but he kept talking about how he was limited and how he couldn't ask for things or demand things without having the proper channels or without getting permission from the government, the university, and all of that stuff. Now, where it gets interesting is because in talking about the planning for the event, the text messages do come up, and a lot of people are saying that the text messages are talking about the building where the tent was and the roof right above it. And so Gary, in my opinion, he didn't do a good enough job pressing him on the fact that, hey, this text message, this text thread was about one building, but there are other buildings that have roofs, right? And I'm not sure if I heard this correctly, but it sounded like Brian was saying that the text message was generally about all of the roofs, and so I'm not 100% sure about that. I tried to go back and look for that moment, but I couldn't find it, and so I do find that interesting because a lot of people had problems with that text message. One, because I got you covered was not a clear answer. And what came out in this interview, I heard somebody say it on one of the different channels that I was watching, and they basically basically said that this was not a text thread between Brian and the chief of police. This was a text thread between Dan Flood and the chief of police. And so it's interesting when you think about that, because he talks about how this was a conversation between Dan and the chief of police, and then also I guess that conversation, like the screenshot, would have circulated down to his team, because Dan Floyd is basically their boss. He's the one, I guess, who contacts Brian's team and all of that stuff. And so he was saying that I guess communication was shared, they did their jobs, but if that screenshot was shared prior to the day of the assassination, I wonder if other people had questions about what I Got You Covered meant, because if multiple people saw that screenshot or that text exchange and they didn't ask any questions, that's a problem considering how people reacted to this clip in the Shawn Ryan interview. Now, I want to move on to Dan Flood. So in the Shawn Ryan interview, I was really confused on whether or not there were two Dan. It just seemed really confusing with the way that he was talking about it. And so in this interview, he did clarify that a little bit, and he basically clarified that Dan Flood is working for Turning Point USA as basically their security advisor, and they work under Dan Floyd. And so that made me curious about why Brian is doing these interviews. If he's not like the main guy in charge, if he's contracted, the responsibility doesn't necessarily fall on him, in my opinion. It falls on who his boss is. And so his boss would be Dan Flood. And so I feel like Dan Flood should be the one doing these interviews, accounting for what the security team did or didn't do, accounting for the decisions that were made, and really providing a defense and explanation for what happened from a security and tactical standpoint that day. And so I'm very curious about why he's not having these interviews, and I'm not watching the Charlie Kirk show, and so I don't know if he's appeared or if he's made comments on other platforms and I'm just not aware of it. But I do find it interesting that it's the contractor who is coming out publicly trying to defend himself and his men and his company, but it's really Dan Flood who should be out in the public and kind of answering all of this. And it's probably because he works for Turning Point USA, and so if they want to defend themselves, they may need a third party to do that. But I really do think it should be Dan Flood having these interviews and really explaining what the security team was doing that day. They also went into the meta glasses, because that was a huge thing. People thought that he was taking a picture of Charlie Kirk or a video of Charlie Kirk and sending it to wherever as confirmation that he was dead. And so people are really trying to say, hey, you guys are in on this and all of that stuff. And so Brian confirmed that they were meta glasses. They didn't take video, but they could take still pictures. And when Dan was adjusting his glasses, he was saying that he was just adjusting them. He wasn't triggering anything. He wasn't taking pictures. It was just he changed his position and just adjusted his glasses. And so I don't really want to read too much into that, but I do find it interesting that people picked up on that when they were watching footage of what happened that day, and they're questioning every little thing. And so you really do need to be able to account for everything that happened, and it's difficult because there's so much that happened, right? Moving on, I want to talk about the shooting and the medkit situation. So again, he talks about hearing two sounds, the bullet hitting Charlie Kirk, and then I guess the shot. And so I don't really fully understand it. And when I originally saw the video of him getting shot, I saw a faraway video, and I think I saw the video pan to like the direction of where the sound came from, and then back to Charlie Kirk. And so for me, it made it seem like one thing happened first and then the other. But I foolishly watched the video and I got sick watching it, and I realized that the sound and the visual impact kind of happened at the same time. I couldn't tell what happened first as far as hearing the sound or seeing the visual impact, and so I have a better understanding of what people were saying, but they didn't really clarify that in this interview. And then Gary also asked Brian if he was able to tell what type of gun it was, and I don't think we got a clear answer on that, because again, he was giving these really long answers and giving extra information that kind of didn't lead you back to the original question and answer. And so I don't know if that was just something that they didn't really catch or pick up on, but he didn't clarify, like, hey, so what type of gun do you think it was, right? And so I found that interesting, because people want to know if he was able to tell what type of gun that was and all of that stuff. And then the other thing they talked about was the EMTs. I'm not sure if they're called EMTs, but they were medical professionals on staff in lieu of an ambulance and all of that stuff. And so people were talking about how they basically refuse help from those people, and he was saying like, hey, they didn't have anything that I didn't already have, so it wouldn't have been helpful. And then they also did not want to rely on an ambulance to get Charlie Kirk to the hospital because they felt like they were better equipped. They were going to be able to drive faster without waiting for the ambulance to get there and then also travel the distance to the hospital. The other thing that I found interesting was that they were talking about how they had to drive like 60, 100 miles per hour to get to the hospital. They didn't have a siren. They were moving through traffic and all of that stuff. And so obviously having a siren in your car, I don't know what the laws are on that, but you would think that a security team would have something like that so that they can navigate through traffic easier in situations like that. And they also talked about what they were doing after Charlie Kirk was shot. And so you can see them all kind of under the table or kind of kneeling down next to Charlie. They talked about how they were trying to cover him and prevent him from getting hit by other shots because they really did not know what was happening. And they talked about that in the Shawn Ryan interview. And so here he's saying, we didn't hand off anything. We weren't acting weird. We weren't trying to finish him off or anything like that. We were really focused on attending to him and then also trying to get him moved so that we could treat him when he wasn't really in the line of fire. And one thing that they talked about was how, I think this is kind of like a grainy image, but there's a screenshot or a video footage of where it looks like the guys are smiling. And I think that that's just like an awkward moment in between frames, especially when you have to zoom in, and as you zoom in, it kind of gets grainy. And so I think that that's what's happening because I think either Brian or Gary said that it looks like a grimace. And so obviously that's not a smile, that's a very different emotion and gesture, right? And so, or a different facial expression. And so I do find that interesting because again, you do have people trying to dissect every little thing and ask questions and really trying to put the pieces together, especially because there's not a whole lot of information that is coming from the government and the FBI. Moving on, they talked about conspiracies, and they were really talking about how there's popular people out there who have a platform. They are able to reach millions of people or thousands of people, whatever number you want to use, and the point is they have a lot of influence. And so Candace came up because she is the one who is really kind of leading the charge on the investigation. She's not the only one investigating, but she does probably have the biggest name attached to the Charlie Kirk investigation right now. And so Brian spoke to how I guess he felt about popular content creators and Candace specifically leading the charge and kind of pointing the finger at them and different people. And he was basically saying, I let it wash over me. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. All of that stuff, right? And so this is where I started to see that disconnect of where he's saying, like, I understand why people don't trust the government. I understand that people want answers. I want answers too. But then he resents the fallout of what that looks like when he is the one who's in the center of all of that because of what happened to Charlie Kirk. And again, I said this in my first video, but because he is part of a security team and they were literally hired to keep Charlie Kirk alive, they're going to get the blame regardless of what theories people have, what weird things people point out. When it comes down to the basics, they were supposed to protect Charlie Kirk and they didn't, and so that is why they are getting a lot of heat. Even if people didn't have conspiracy theories or if they had more information from the FBI or the government, I think in some sense people would still blame the security team because that's literally what they were there for. Their only job was to protect Charlie Kirk. And I found it interesting when they were talking about Candace. Gary asked a question, Brian responded, and then Gary basically is talking about, responsibility, personal responsibility when it comes to what you say on the internet and all of that stuff. And when he's talking about Candace, Gary says, I respect her, I follow her and all of that stuff. And so he's saying, like, I don't know what's driving her to do this. I don't know what her motivations are. And then he kind of moves away from the topic. And so that is a really interesting moment because he's not outright calling her a liar or saying that she's wrong or whatever. And he's also not saying that she's completely right. So, right, he's kind of in that middle ground. And that is very interesting because you do have a lot of people coming out saying that Candace is demonic, she's evil, she's ruining TPUSA, she's burning down everything that Charlie Kirk built and all of that stuff. And here's a moment where you expect someone to say that and they are not. So it does make you wonder if other people who are saying that are being genuine when they say that, or is that a campaign to make Candace look like she's crazy? Because when you watch a lot of these political movies, and it's funny because they do talk about the Bourne movies, the Jason Bourne movies, and how everybody thinks they're a CIA agent, they think they can investigate and all of that stuff.